Oh, that's right. DM and the PM, baby.
What's going on, guys, and welcome to DM in the PM, the show that is, for better or for worse, far less sexually charged than the intro might suggest. It is a show, though, that is jam-packed with lots of awesome tips for all you aspiring DMs or you old salts, you veterans out there. My name is Tom Quinn, resident Dungeon Master here at Modern Myth. And today we are going to be kicking off a series that we're calling The Building Blocks of a Campaign. And rather than an assessment of individual components, encounter building, for example, or running chase sequences, what we're going to be doing is looking at a series of topics that I have found to be very scalable in virtually every aspect of world building, encounter building, fleshing out narratives. So in general, these tend to be kind of the backbone of the way I think about building the game. Today's topic is going to be motivation. The role of motivation in the context that we're going to be talking about it, and in the kind of the game building space, motivation fundamentally is going to serve as the flavor really for the entirety of the campaign world, whether you're building an entire setting or a single encounter. Ultimately, it is the motivation of all of the characters in a given scene that creates the conflict in your scene, that creates the tension, that creates the catharsis, should that tension find relief. So fundamentally, we're going to be using motivation as a means of coloring in what is otherwise kind of a black and white world. And we'll get into some examples that I think really help to flesh that out. Importantly, like I said, with all the videos in this series, motivation really is a scalable aspect of world building. We could be talking about a single creature in a broad skirmish and the motivations of that single creature. You could scale that all the way out to the entire world setting, the campaign setting that maybe you're working up for your next campaign. When you start to get to that scale, you end up in a place where now we're talking about the motivations of armies and powerful political interests, evil villains who are enacting darkness upon this world. So keep that in mind when we're talking about really all of these topics, is that I tend to think of this as like a series of concentric circles where your most kind of micro analysis would be that center circle, but you can step out layer and layer and layer all the way out until you are talking about something as broad as an entire campaign setting. And really at every level of analysis, you could run this similar kind of assessment of the motivation of the players in that space, and it really does start to help you kind of flesh out precisely what types of conflicts are arising or have been playing out in a given region. There's really no end to what motivation can add to a space that can very well exist. You could certainly create a campaign setting that has virtually no motivated actors in it. The problem with that is there's not much for your players to do in that space. If all of your arch villains aren't motivated to conduct evil in the realm, there's not going to be a whole lot for your players to respond to. So that's kind of a very surface level example of the way motivation is going to drive everything in your game world. Let's jump into a couple of quick examples. We'll actually use kind of one example, but we will kind of look at it with a variety of different motivations, and it's an example that's going to sound a little mundane right out of the gate, and that's actually intentional, because I think the importance of motivation, it's easy, I think, for most people to understand why a mastermind, the leader of a rogues guild or a thieves guild, that's a character that very clearly should have some motivations, whatever those motivations are, and they can be whatever you want them to be. But the example that I wanted to use to talk about this, I think, is more illustrative, and that is kind of a classic D&D woodland trope, which is the wolf pack encounter. For those of you who have run games, played games. I would be blown away if at some point or another you weren't faced down by a group of vicious wolves. And more often than not, certainly in my experience, I think those encounters tend to be kind of lacking in motivation. And so let's dive into that a little bit in terms of exploring what motivation can do to really color in what is an otherwise pretty mundane encounter. So using that premise, our heroes have been traveling through the woods. They find themselves locked in this ambush. These wolves have been tracking them for some time. The process that I find easiest to begin to assign motivation to entities within the world space is to ask two separate whys. The first why kind of is more of an establishing. It's establishing kind of the verb, the action that's taking place. And then there's kind of a deeper why. So using the wolf example, we might say, why are these wolves attacking our party? And let's say, for starters, I'm sure you could rattle off a few motivations off your head at home. In fact, drop some motivations and let's let some of them unspool in the comments, because it is really cool to take something mundane like this and start assigning motivation to it and see what kind of cool little adventures and awesome little hooks develop just from, kind of thinking out loud in this capacity. But for the purposes of this example, let's say that the first why that is answered, the motivation of these wolves is they are starving. These are desperate creatures. They are hungry. They are starving. Great. That's a great reason for wolves to be attacking your party. But the second why is really what begins to lend some color to this space, to this old growth forest that we found ourselves in. The second why of why are these wolves starving? And there's any number of answers to this, but it begins to immediately set a tone, create a certain identity for this space. So for starters, let's say that these wolves are starving because a young, brash nobleman, maybe a minor lord in a nearby settlement, has been hosting the greatest hunting tournament that the realm has ever seen. Men and women are traveling from all over the realm to participate, and they've been hunting this forest barren. We've already introduced a thread that the parties may opt to follow, may not, in that there must be this nearby settlement, there must be this lord figure, and so there's one kind of very brief example of the way in which these wolves might be motivated. A counterpoint to that second why could be that perhaps there is a new apex predator in these woods, something that has simply been wiping that game out, something that maybe has only been whispered about in the taverns in nearby towns. Travelers on the road, seem spooked, and it's kind of common knowledge in these parts to not travel these roads after dark. Quite a different scenario, and a very different tone. You begin setting that scene of downed game with their carcasses picked clean, overturned wagons from other travelers that had made their way through here, their beasts of burden ravaged by some kind of beast. That's a very different feeling space than the original example of the Lord and his hunting tournament. Both of these, however, have now created this kind of radius. If this encounter with the wolves is the epicenter of the little bit of lore that we're starting to build in this space, we're now creating a radius outward from that the players can exist and explore and interact in, that they can begin kind of pulling at those threads that just the most basic of motivation being assigned has kind of allowed for them to do. And moreover, because we've given this a little bit of thought, we're fully prepared to allow them to pull those threads and not have to immediately be on our heels and be in improv mode. And not that there's anything wrong with being in that space, but you're kind of doing yourself a favor of understanding the motivation of these wolves. There's a whole bunch of things you can kind of scrap from your improv spectrum, because we know that, oh, well, Lord Tevely he's been running this hunting tournament. So now we can kind of play that game and begin laying out some of the other breadcrumbs that might lead the adventurers to find that there's a lot more to this hunting tournament maybe than originally meets the eye. Perhaps the party decides they want to go participate in this tournament. Perhaps they come to find that Lord Tevely is a much darker figure than outward appearances would suggest. The list goes on and on. Importantly, too, is that these motivations also speak to the behavior of, specifically when we're talking about motivations of enemies in combat, they speak to the behavior of these combatants. The monster manual, and I mean, there's tons of resources out there that would give you an indication of perhaps how the various creatures in the world might interact in combat. But we can take that a step further by saying these particular wolves, seeing as they're starving, they might be willing to fight to the last wolf. If it means that what surviving wolves are there go to bed with full stomachs, these are desperate animals, so they might fight to the death. Conversely, a player making some substantial offering of food, just throwing, maybe they've got some salt pork or something in their rations, could be enough to dissuade the wolves. That's obviously at the DM's discretion, but it's a good example of how motivation of what is a typically pretty mundane creature begins to influence and speak to the way in which that creature is going to interact with the party in the world. Let's take a little bit of a different tact with regard to those same wolves, just as a point of reference. Let's say instead of starvation, the driving force, that first why are these wolves attacking the party? Let's say it's territorial. Let's say that the party has actually found themselves too close to the den of these beasts. Great. Motivations have shifted dramatically now from these wolves. We were just talking about combat. Acting territorially, we already know that there's a good chance if the party is willing to flee from that combat, if they decide, you know what, we didn't intend to trespass on these guys, let's back away, let's play this smart. There's not much reason as a DM why you would allow a motivation of territory to result in the wolves, say, chasing them to an entirely different region. So just a quick example of kind of how behavior in combat can be immediately influenced by the motivations that you've kind of assigned to entities within the world. The second why, which as I said, is really the most important one in that scenario. Again, you can kind of unspool these at your whim, and anytime you're building something in the world space, I would encourage you to take a moment to just think about, hey, I've just placed this figure into the world space. What is he doing? Why is he doing it? Asking the two whys will immediately just kind of breathe some life into that space, into that character. But let's say, for instance, that these territorial wolves, the immediate question is why are they being so territorial? And that why can be truly mundane. This is not a call to say that every single thing in your world needs to have some fantastical reason for behaving the way that they're behaving. Wolves don't like people near their dens. That's a reasonable enough why for the second one. Let's say, we can elaborate on that a little bit. Let's say that there are some new wolf pups brooding in the den. That's a great reason for the pack to maybe be a little more on high alert. Conversely, you can go a bit more fantastical with that same notion. Let's say that these wolves, a new alpha has taken over the pack, but it's no ordinary wolf that has stepped in. A behemoth werewolf, though badly injured from his original turning, has kind of taken over this pack, and with that wolf, the werewolf on the mend, it's really a kind of a hypersensitive time for the pack. All of these, you can see how they rapidly begin to lead into little hooks, whether they be side quests, whether they become something much larger than that. Maybe they become nothing at all, but the amount of investment that we need to make to assign a little bit of motivation is really minimal and oftentimes can be done on the fly. Making note earlier about improvisation, I find very frequently as I'm dropping an encounter into the world space, it might not be an encounter that I had completely planned. I might just be wanting to spice an element up in real time. Just kind of as you're setting that encounter, setting the scene, you can ask those couple of whys in your head real quick, and you already have a sense of, okay, this is why these figures are behaving the way they are. A group of bandits are holding the party up because Night Watch dozed off. Great. bandits tend to be motivated by the monetary reward of their efforts. But again, there's all sorts of room for you to be creative in that space. Those bandits could be motivated very differently. So that's entirely up to you. It's one of the more enjoyable aspects, I think, of bringing new things into the game world, is beginning to flesh out those motivations. That is to say, there are many times where I will have motivations that have been kind of fleshed out to the degree, let's say that given in the wolf examples, that quite frankly, the party has no interest in following up on. They might be beelining to their next destination. They might be on the clock. Great. But it simply gives me that little bit of breathing room that if they'd have said, you know what, this is actually sounding really interesting. I got to know what's going on with this hunting tournament. You know, if it's something that holds a particular appeal to someone in the party or whatever that thread is, you are much better prepared to allow them to pull that and really make that a compelling narrative rather than just a random encounter from a random encounter table. Lastly, the last thing I really want to say about motivation, and I think that this ties into our next episode really well, so I'm not going to go too far into it, is having a really strong grasp as a DM, if you are a new DM or new to the players you're playing with, or if you're a seasoned veteran at the table, the importance of understanding the motivations of the characters, the main players at the table. All of those PCs presumably have their own motivations for doing things at the table. And as a DM, it really is crucial that we're understanding those motivations such that we can create motivations elsewhere in the world that are congruent to the party, that run completely perpendicular. As I said, we're not going to go too deep into that because our next episode, which is going to be incentives and consequences, really is going to harp on kind of utilizing those player motivations to help drive your narratives without running the risk of getting into, kind of the dangers of getting on rails. We'll get into that next episode. I think that's pretty much all I have to say on motivation. I really do hope that this gives you a little something to think about as you are designing your next encounter or your next world for that matter. I definitely find that one of the fastest ways that I'm able to flesh out a space and really start sinking my teeth into the nuanced interactions that are taking place between individual entities and large-scale outfits like guilds and armies, what have you, is to begin this exercise of assigning some simple motivations and allowing you to kind of spool those out until you see those motivations come into contest with one another. It's a really, really powerful tool. I would love to hear down in the comments below your thoughts on motivation. What are you doing when you're designing your own encounters? And really anything. Again, this space, DM in the PM, really is intended to be a place where all of us who love running this game, it's the greatest game in the world as far as I'm concerned. We're all running it for different reasons, but we're all running it because it's something that we enjoy doing. I'd love to hear in the comments what it is that you are loving about your experience as a DM, maybe some of the struggles you're having as a DM. I'd love to hear it all. That said, I think this pretty much wraps it up here on DM in the PM. If you got anything out of this conversation, please like, comment, and subscribe. It means the world to us here at Modern Myth. Beyond that, the world is yours.